We're at our first stop here at the Visitors Information Center. Please step right in and we can pick up a lot of facts about Ybor City. Here we are at Jose Marti Memorial Park, and a lot of people love this little piece of Ybor City, and if you'll step inside, I'll tell you a little bit more about it. As you can see, we have a statue here of Jose Marti, and to the Cuban people, Jose Marti was basically a combination of John Quincy Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. He was a great speaker, author, poet. He came to Ybor City over 21 times looking for money and arms to fight, which would later become known as the Spanish-American War, but at that time it was just a revolutionary war. In Cuba, over the previous 50 years, from about 1850 to about 1900, you had a lot of these little revolutionary wars that would spring up. They'd usually be curtailed by the Spanish government, who would send in soldiers and clean up the mess, and things would go on again. And then about 5 or 6 years later, they'd have another revolution that were unsuccessful. The difference was in this one, Jose Marti got it started. Was well loved by all the Cuban people. He was exiled from Cuba, went to live in Europe and in the States for a while, went back to Cuba, became a guerrilla war fighter, and unfortunately perished on the field of battle, thus becoming a martyr for the cause. And you can go to Cuba, and just about every village of any size will have a statue of Jose Marti. Now, the particularly interesting thing about this particular park is what you're standing on here is Cuban soil, much as an embassy would be. This piece of property, which was owned by a family called Pedrosos, owned it. The house eventually burnt down. But the one thing that was most famous about this corner, when Jose Marti was wounded here in Tampa by some Spanish agents, they brought him here and he recovered at this house. And it later became a calling card for anybody who was in with the revolution to come to this area and meet at this house. Eventually the house burnt down, and the people of Ybor City so much loved Jose Marti that they purchased this property and donated it to the people of Cuba. So the soil that you're standing on is Cuban soil. As you walk through that gate, you have left the U.S. One of the interesting things here we have in Ybor City. Okay, the reason I asked you to stop here is to show you something very special about Ybor City. The building behind you, which was the original Martinez Ybor cigar factory, is about 120 years old. The building directly across from us is a parking garage, which is about 7 years old now. Now, Ybor City is what's known as a National Historic Landmark District, one of 3 here in Florida. The difference is that in Ybor City you cannot build a new-looking modern building. Anything that you build here must adhere to the architectural structures that are surrounding it. And it's not 1 or 2 or 3 buildings, it's the entire district. It's almost about 3 square miles. But as you can see, the parking garage that we have here across the street, most parking garages are usually cement slabs. You can't have that here in Ybor City. It's got to be finished off with the red brick so that it will fit into the same architectural motif of the area. And everybody likes that little bit of history, and to keep it all pristine as much as possible. So this is one of the little stops that we make along the way to point that out so that people can understand how special Ybor City is. And we'll continue on this way. And now, here we are in the Martinez Ybor Cigar Factory patio. I'm going to turn it over to Bob Alorda.
Good evening. First thing I'd like to tell you is a lot of people think that Vincent Martinez Ybor's Cigar Factory was the first. It is not. It was Sanchez and Haya. But this place became very big, very famous for one reason only. And it's not that it was bad cigars. In fact, it was one of the best. But as the real tracks are there used to be more of them coming through the yard. And what they had here was tobacco auction. Philip Morris, Liggett, Salt Lucky Strike, everybody came here to buy the tobacco. There was bids going on. As a kid, I used to stand out here and watch it. I enjoyed it. Now, when I say as a kid, no, I'm not talking back in the 1800s. I'm talking back in the 40s. But this was a beautiful time. And as you can see, Ybor City, or the factory itself, is humongous. Sanchez and Haya did not have the same size, but they were still the first by one day. One of the biggest things here, you've got to understand that all cigar makers were probably the most best informed people in the area. They had electors. What was that? There was gentlemen that would sit on a podium inside the factory and read the newspaper from back to front, front to back every day. 3 languages, Spanish, Italian, and English. And that's why we have the trilingual newspaper here in Ybor City, La Gazeta. The other thing is, if you got to understand, during that era there was no radios, no TVs. We've been spoiled through time. But the ladies, their wives, and their children used to come and stand outside the windows and listen to the electors as they went on. When it was lunchtime, the husbands would come to the windows, the ladies would give them their lunch, and they would eat there. And afterwards, they would clean up the area, police the area, call it what you like. But they stayed there all day as long as the elector was reading and speaking. When they finished with a newspaper, they went into classic novels of that era. And that's how people got educated.
And here we are at the El Pasaje Hotel, Ybor City's first grand hotel. You can tell by the architecture, it's meant to look the Italian Renaissance. Notice each one of the windows is a room of its own. This is not a hotel like you would find nowadays. This was more of a men's dormitory type hotel. Of course, we had very many famous people stay here, and they would hang out, of course, at the Cherokee Club, which was the hotel's bar. Next, we'll be heading to the very famous site of where Jose Marti would speak at the Martinez Ybor Steps. Here we are at the Martinez Ybor Cigar Factory, and these metal steps. And these metal steps actually have a place in history. As you can tell by the notation here, this was dedicated. This is where Jose Marti, when he came to speak, would speak. Why? Because up here, he was himself a great orator and could speak. And you have to use your imagination at this point a little bit, but people would come from all over the city of Tampa. This street over here would be filled with thousands of people to hear Jose Marti speak, because he spoke on the subject that they were near and dear to their heart, Cuban independence. Also, you have to keep in mind that in those days, people would come out for anything. No radio, no TV. People would come out for a public hanging. So they would come not only to hear him speak, but they might see history happen, which some of them did at one time, when an assassination attempt on Jose Marti, he was shot on these steps and later taken to the Pedroso house. Across the street from us, you'll notice the Don Vicente de Ybor Historic Inn, which Mr. Draxshiver has spent a lot of time and money to refurbish and make it look all beautiful again. But before that, it was known as the Buen Público Hospital, and this was one of the hospitals that were in the Mutual Aid Society. And whenever you needed to spend time in the actual hospital, this is the place that you would come to stay, among other hospitals that were later built. Mr. Shriver has spent a lot of money to refurbish the area, and it's a historic bed and breakfast inn now. And it's really a great place to stay if you're coming down to Ybor City, because you're only 2 blocks away from 7th Avenue, where everything happens. And here we are at the Ciclo Cubano, the Cuban Club. This building, built in 1819, is a social club which was a very important element here in Ybor City. The social club is where you could come and meet people from your home country, talk in the same language, but they offered all kinds of benefits. Not only for the socially inclined, they had dances and parties and things that let you know what was going on in your home country, but the social clubs were responsible for what was known as the Mutual Aid Society. And in this was a type of insurance offered by all of the social clubs where you could have yourself and your family taken care of for about 25 cents a week. And most of the time, of course, the doctors would come to your house and take care of you then. But if you needed to go into a hospital, they also had hospitals. And when you went to them, they did not charge you anything because you were part of the Mutual Aid Society. The Cuban Club itself is a very historic building, one of the largest and grandest of all the social clubs here in Ybor City. Of course, a statue of Jose Marti on the corner. As I said, very well loved in this area. The bottom floor is the canteen area. And in that, they also had a gymnasium. Now imagine for yourself being here in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and not having any family or any connections here. You could come to the Cuban Club and have a hot meal in the canteen. Also, the canteen served as a gymnasium. So they had an indoor track, basketball courts, weight room, boxing, above-ground swimming pool in the back, everything for a young man to help work off a lot of his energy. In the center of the building, the 2 stories in the center are, of course, the theater section. Many people don't realize that Tampa was a very large vaudeville stop. As large as New York, Chicago, Cleveland, any place up north, except it was all in Spanish down here. So the touring companies usually went from Tampa to Miami, hit Mexico, hit a few cities there, Central South America, hit a few of the islands, and came back here with a new group. And every group would come through about once a year, and you'd have new groups coming in probably every week, every other week. So as I said, very much into vaudeville in those days. Of course, that was the only type of entertainment. The top floor, which is hardly noticeable from this vantage point, but is the main ballroom. And a very extravagant room. Recently went under a lot of remodeling, but the arched ceiling that it had in there was a full painted mural, much like the Sixtine Chapel, and it told the story of Cuba. Unfortunately, they had some water damage, and they were not able to repair that, so they had to drop the ceiling. But I remember as a child going in there, just laying on the floor, and you could see the story unfold through paintings. And it was one of the best pieces of art that I've ever seen in the city of Tampa. And unfortunately, it's lost forever now.
Here's our initial display, and really talks about the founding of Ybor City. And what we usually try and introduce everybody too, is how important Ybor was to the development of Tampa, and also making Ybor City really the cultural backdrop for all of Tampa. And the story is very interesting. Mr. Ybor came here not on a direct route. He was born in Valencia, Spain. At 14 years of age, his family basically asked him to live with family in Cuba because they were making all young men join the military in Spain, and his family didn't want that lifestyle for him. And so Mr. Ybor actually moved down to Cuba as a young man, and as a young man he starts to learn about the tobacco industry. But because of political problems that were going on in Cuba during the time period, the Cubans were beginning their revolution to gain their independence. Ybor became known as a friend of the Cuban people, a sympathizer. And obviously that was a big embarrassment for the Spaniards. And so the rumor was out that the Spaniards were going to try and jail Ybor and even trying to kill him. And so Ybor had to flee Cuba, and he came to Key West. And that's really where our story picks up here. Some of the motivating factors that brought Ybor from Key West to Tampa. He was looking for an area that had a good port, also an area that had land access for a train. And another big thing for him was the fact that we have a high level of humidity here, which is very good for the storage of tobacco. So all of these things coupled together, also with the fact that the city of Tampa helped facilitate the sale of the area to Ybor by offering 40 acres of land for $4,000. It's a pretty good deal. In Tampa, you can't beat that nowadays. And so Ybor buys this entire area and really comes up with a very unique concept and really what differentiates Ybor City from any other factory town in the United States. This idea of not only building the workers their homes, but actually selling them their own property and giving them home ownership. Ybor's idea was, if I can give them their own homes, that'll keep them from going back and forth to Cuba, a big problem that he had in Key West. And so he starts to build these homes for $400 to $900. He takes $1.50 to $2.50 out of their paychecks, and he gives them a zero-interest loan. So in about 5 to 6 years, as a worker here, you could have your own home. The word gets out quickly, and we start to see all the immigrants come into this area to either work in the cigar factories or to cater to it somehow. And we see the population in Tampa go from 700 to 800 people before Ybor was here. After Ybor comes here, it's at 5,000. Okay, so a lot about what we talk about here in the museum talks a lot about the history that brought Ybor here. But an interesting fact about the museum is that it's actually housed in an old bakery, the old Ferlita Bakery. It started in 1896 as a wood frame bakery. There was a big fire in 1922 that destroyed the building. And one of the things that remained after the fire was the ovens. They actually closed the doors on the ovens, and they were able to save them. And so what they decided to do was actually keep the site of the bakery. And they actually built this building around the oven, and they added another oven, which we have on the other side over here. So the original oven that we have dates from 1896. The other oven that we have dates from 1922. But it's a good idea of how a lot of these Italians and the Sicilians were coming here and actually starting up a lot of the bakeries that we had in the area for a lot of the cigar rollers as they were working in the factories. Because as you were working, you were brought Cuban coffee while you were rolling your cigars, but you were also brought a lot of the breads and the sandwiches that we had in this area. And so a pretty good way of life for the workers here. And this is a good example of a bakery and how it would operate here. We certainly invite everybody to come here basically any day of the week. With the exception of Christmas Day, New Year's Day, Thanksgiving Day, those are the only days that the state park here is closed. Every other day we're open from 9 until 5. But we especially recommend if you can come in on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday from 9:30 to 1. We have Dagoberto Troncoso here, who's actually hand-rolling tobacco. Dago is a master cigar roller who's been rolling cigars now for over 60 years. Started basically in 1945 as a master cigar roller in Cuba. He actually rolled his own brand of cigar in Cuba. He came here to the United States to live with family, and we were lucky enough to actually ask him to come in here, volunteer for us, and actually show us the tobacco process. Give us an idea of how these cigar rollers used to work when they used to work in the factories. And what you're actually going to see Dago doing is the entire process here. He actually sorts and selects his own tobacco. He brings it here and he actually prepares it for us. And what he's doing now is what we call the loose leaf bunch. He takes this bunch of tobacco and he actually will put it in a press. He'll keep it in that press for 25 to 30 minutes. He'll take it out of that press. He'll actually rotate the cigars. After he rotates them, then he'll put them back in the press. When he takes it out the second time, then we're actually able to watch him put on the wrapper leaf on the cigars. And so it's really an intriguing process. But again, a bigger part of having Dago here is to give you an idea of how these factories used to work. And what we have here is a large mural of a cigar factory taken in 1929, and really what you can think of as the heyday of Ybor City. During that year alone, we produced 290 million cigars hand-rolled in Ybor City alone. And you'll see some very interesting things in this mural. Things like the cigar rollers wearing pressed white shirts. They have their straw hats on. A lot of them have bow ties on. They really didn't think of themselves as blue-collar factory workers. They thought of themselves as artists. And that's because they were doing something that no one else could do, and that was hand-rolling this pure Havana tobacco cigars. Another thing you'll notice, people of different ages, people of different ethnic backgrounds, people of different races, and women and men all working together in the same factory. Something that was very unique and something that we're very proud of for our factory town here in Ybor City. Here in Ybor City, the people could live together, they could work together. It wasn't until they went to the outside of Ybor City that they actually had to be segregated during this time period. Well, we'd like to thank you for visiting the Ybor City Museum State Park, because we're very proud to talk about the history and how unique Ybor City is, really in the entire history of the United States.
Okay, we've just come out of the museum. Did you folks enjoy that? Great. Well, we're here at Centennial Park now, ending our tour, with the immigrant statue, of course. And this statue is here, was donated by the people of Ybor City, so that people could understand the plight of many of the immigrants that came here. Many of them came to Ybor City exactly like this, with nothing other than the clothes on their back and maybe a couple of suitcases. And this park is dedicated to that pioneering spirit that brought them here to Ybor City. And with that, we'll end our tour for right now. We do have opportunities for extended tours, so please come back. Don't be shy. We'll be here 7 days a week, so we're always here for you. So long from Ybor City.